No one expected the Empire's most infamous ball to begin with a theft. But before that stolen sapphire caught the light of 1,000 chandeliers and ripped the mask off half the imperial court, there was a man standing alone in the wreckage of his own making. Duke Caedric Ravaryn, ruler of the wealthiest duchy in the realm. A man who buried love once and swore he would never be that weak again. This is the story of how the Empire's most ruthless heart learned that control is just another word for fear. And fear, left unchecked, will consume everything it claims to protect. Stay until the very end. What happens at the Winter Ball will change everything you think you know. The candles in the war chamber had burned down to nothing. Caedric Ravaryn stood at the massive oak table with both fists pressed against a map of territories he had bled for, traded for, threatened men into surrendering. The wax had pooled across the eastern border markings, slowly devouring the ink lines that separated Ravaryn land from the crown holdings beyond the Ashenmere River. He watched it spread. He did not move to stop it. The door behind him opened without a knock. "You look like a man deciding which part of himself to amputate first." Lord Harlan Drace stepped into the dim chamber with the easy confidence of the only man alive who could walk into the Duke of Ravaryn's war room uninvited and walk out with his teeth still in his skull. He was Caedric's chief advisor, his oldest remaining friend, and the only person in the Empire foolish enough to tell him the truth on a regular basis. Caedric did not turn around. The Vaemont delegation refused. I heard. They refused because Aldrich Vaemont believes I am weakened, that the northern territories are bleeding grain stores faster than I can replenish them, that the trade route through Heron's Pass has been compromised since the flooding last autumn, and I have no alternative supply chain. Caedric's voice was flat, controlled, the kind of calm that made servants leave rooms. He is correct on all three counts. Harlan pulled a chair from the table and sat down without invitation. So fix it. With what? Caedric finally turned. The firelight caught the sharp edges of his face, the hollowed cheeks, the jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the fortress walls. He was 34 years old and looked like a man who had aged a decade in 4. The treasury is stable but thin. The northern estates have been mismanaged since I pulled the stewards south for the border disputes. And every lord between here and the capital smells blood in the water because I have spent 4 years consolidating power without producing an heir. Harlan studied him. You know the solution. Don't. Marriage. I said don't. The silence between them had weight. It pressed against the walls and settled into the cracks between the ancient stones. Harlan had served the Ravaryn family since before Caedric inherited the title. He had stood beside him at his first wife's funeral. He had watched a grieving young duke transform grief into ambition and ambition into something harder, something colder, something that functioned with terrifying efficiency but no longer resembled anything human. He had also watched him take Lady Celestine Vane into his bed 3 months after the burial and keep her there ever since. The Emperor's Council has received 4 formal inquiries about the Ravaryn succession in the last year alone, Harlan said carefully. 2 from allied houses, 2 from houses that would very much like to stop being allied. If you do not secure a political marriage within the next season, the vultures will not wait for you to die before they start carving. Caedric walked to the window. Beyond the glass, the Ravaryn ground stretched into darkness. Somewhere out there, past the manicured hedgerows and the ornamental lake and the stables that housed 40 war horses, the northern road wound toward territories that were slowly starving because he had been too focused on the south to notice. Control. That was the word that lived inside his chest like a second heartbeat. Control the borders. Control the trade. Control the court. Control the grief that still woke him at 3 a.m. with the phantom scent of lavender and the sound of a voice he would never hear again. Find me a match, he said without turning. Someone politically useful, someone whose family brings territory or trade leverage, someone who will not expect anything beyond the arrangement. Harlan leaned forward. And Celestine? What about her? She has been operating as your consort in everything but title for nearly 4 years. She has influence over half your household staff. She has cultivated relationships with 3 of your most important trading partners. She will not take kindly to being displaced. Caedric turned from the window. His eyes were the color of winter iron. Celestine is not being displaced. She is not in a position that can be displaced. She has never held a title. She has never been promised one. She exists in my life because I allow it. That has not changed. The words came out with surgical precision. No anger, no guilt. Just the cold arithmetic of a man who had learned to categorize every relationship by what it cost and what it returned. Harlan watched him for a long moment. Then he nodded once. I will begin the inquiries. He left without another word. The door closed behind him with the soft click of inevitability. Caedric stood alone in the dying light and tried to remember the last time he had made a decision that was not driven by strategy. He could not. That, he told himself, was the point. 3 weeks later, the name arrived on Harlan's desk like a detonation wrapped in parchment. Lady Lysandra Ashford. Caedric read the report in his study while rain hammered the windows hard enough to rattle the frames. The Ashford family controlled the largest unaligned territory in the Empire's eastern corridor. Rich farmland. Established grain routes. A deep-water port that connected to 3 major trading channels. The family had maintained careful neutrality for 2 generations, refusing to pledge to any of the great houses while quietly accumulating the kind of wealth that made neutrality possible. The father, Lord Ashford, was dying. The family had no male heir. Without a marriage alliance, the territory would be absorbed by the crown upon his death, parceled out to whichever noble house had the emperor's ear that particular week. It was, from every strategic angle, a perfect match. Tell me about her, Caedric said without looking up from the documents. Harlan, standing across the desk, cleared his throat. 26. Educated privately. Managed the family's eastern estates for the last 3 years while her father's health declined. By all accounts, she is competent, quiet, not known for political ambition. Not known for political ambition or genuinely without it? In my experience, those are the same thing until they are not. Caedric set the documents down. What does she look like? That is not in the strategic assessment. I did not ask for the strategic assessment. I asked what she looks like. Harlan paused. A careful pause. The kind that meant he was choosing between honesty and diplomacy. She is considered striking, dark hair, pale eyes. The kind of face that court painters would fight over and court gossips would sharpen their knives on. Caedric absorbed this without expression. Beauty was a variable. It could be useful, or it could be complicated. Either way, it was irrelevant to the negotiation. Arrange the meeting. The meeting happened 12 days later in the neutral territory of Lord Pemberton's country estate, a sprawling limestone manor chosen specifically because it offended no one and impressed no one, and therefore served as the perfect backdrop for transactions disguised as civilized conversation. Caedric arrived first. He always arrived first. Controlling the space before the other party entered was not paranoia. It was architecture. He stood in the drawing room with a glass of bourbon he had no intention of drinking and waited. When Lysandra Ashford walked through the door, the first thing he noticed was that she did not hesitate. Most people entering a room where Duke Caedric Ravaryn stood waiting experienced a visible moment of recalibration, a stiffening of the spine, a quick assessment of exits, a flash of something in the eyes that wanted to be confidence but was usually just well-rehearsed composure. Lysandra did none of that. She entered the room the way weather enters a valley, quietly, completely, without asking permission. Duke Ravaryn. Her voice was low and clear, direct without being aggressive. She wore a simple dark blue dress that would have been unremarkable on any other woman, but on her looked like a deliberate refusal to perform. Lady Ashford, he set the untouched bourbon down. Thank you for making the journey. It was not a journey, it was a negotiation. Let us both save time and call it what it is. Something flickered behind Caedric's expression. Not surprise exactly. More like the recognition of a chess piece that had just moved in a direction he had not anticipated. Very well. He gestured to the chairs by the fireplace. Sit. I will stand. This will not take long. He studied her. The pale eyes were steady. The posture was balanced. She was not performing defiance. She was simply declining to pretend that this meeting was anything other than 2 families bartering futures across a table neither of them had chosen. You have read the terms, he said. I have. And? And I have conditions. Caedric's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He was not accustomed to conditions. He was accustomed to dictating terms and watching people nod while calculating how much they could salvage from the wreckage of his generosity. I am listening. Lysandra met his eyes. There was no warmth in the look, but there was no fear either. Just the clean, unsentimental clarity of a woman who had spent years managing an estate, navigating dying trade routes, and keeping a crumbling family legacy alive through sheer refusal to let it collapse. I will fulfill every obligation this marriage requires publicly. I will appear at court functions. I will host diplomatic receptions. I will represent the Ravaryn name with the dignity it demands. But I will not be installed in your household as decoration. I will not compete with Lady Celestine for scraps of attention I never asked for, and I will not pretend that this arrangement is anything more than what it is. The name landed in the room like a blade dropped on marble. Celestine. She knew. Of course she knew. The entire empire knew. Caedric's arrangement with Celestine Vane was the worst-kept secret in aristocratic society. A mistress maintained openly, wielding influence that rivaled most titled women, operating from the Duke's own estate with a freedom that made the court whisper and the Emperor's advisors take careful notes. Caedric's expression did not change. You have been thorough in your research. I have been realistic in my expectations. Lysandra paused. The firelight moved across her face, catching shadows beneath cheekbones that looked like they had been sharpened by years of carrying weight that should have broken someone less stubborn. I am not entering this marriage with illusions, Duke Ravaryn. I am entering it with terms. Honor them, and you will find me a capable partner. Violate them, and you will find that the Ashford territory comes with the same stubbornness that kept it independent for 2 generations. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Caedric Ravaryn had no immediate response. Not because she had shocked him. He did not shock easily, but because she had done something far more dangerous than shock. She had told him the truth without flinching. And some part of him, buried so deep beneath 4 years of armor that he barely recognized it, responded to that truth like a wound responding to pressure. He did not show it. He never showed it. Your terms are acceptable, he said. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the great cathedral of the capital. It was attended by every significant house in the empire. It was covered in the society pages for 3 consecutive weeks. It was discussed in whispered conversations across drawing rooms and trading floors and diplomatic back channels from one end of the realm to the other. It was also, by every measure that mattered to the 2 people standing at the altar, entirely hollow. Caedric spoke the vows with the same mechanical precision he applied to treaty negotiations. Lysandra received them with the composed stillness of a woman signing a contract she intended to honor but not enjoy. They did not touch during the reception. They did not dance. They spoke to each other exactly twice, both times in the presence of ambassadors, both times about grain tariffs. By midnight, the guests were drunk enough to stop pretending they were not watching the new Duchess for signs of weakness. They found none. 3 days after the wedding, Caedric summoned Lysandra to his study. She arrived promptly. She stood in front of his desk the way she had stood in that drawing room, straight, still, unperformative. You will be relocated to Stormhollow Keep, he said. No preamble. No softening. Just the decision delivered like a territorial boundary marker driven into frozen ground. Lysandra blinked once. Stormhollow. It is a Ravaryn estate in the northern territories, remote but defensible. You will have a household staff and a quarterly allowance. The estate will be yours to manage as you see fit. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of things neither of them would say. Stormhollow Keep was not a residence. It was a monument to abandonment, a crumbling fortress on the edge of Ravaryn territory that had not been properly staffed or maintained in over a decade. Sending a new bride there was not delegation. It was exile. And they both knew it. Lysandra studied him across the desk. She studied the rigid shoulders, the controlled breathing, the eyes that looked at her the way they looked at ledgers and maps, and anything else that needed to be filed and forgotten. She understood in that moment something that most people never grasped about Caedric Ravaryn. He was not cruel because he enjoyed cruelty. He was cruel because intimacy terrified him more than any enemy army ever could. and exile was easier than facing what a wife, any wife, might eventually expect him to feel. "Very well," she said. No argument, no tears, no appeal to decency or fairness or the vows that were still fresh enough to leave an echo in an empty cathedral. Just acceptance. Clean and total and infinitely more devastating than any protest could have been. She turned and left his study. Caedric sat alone in the silence she left behind and told himself he felt nothing. He almost believed it. Stormhollow Keep rose from the northern moorland like a fist of black stone punched through the earth by something ancient and furious. The towers listed slightly eastward, battered by decades of wind that never fully stopped. The courtyard was overgrown with thistle and wild grass that crept between cracked flagstones. The windows stared out across miles of empty heath like hollow eyes in a skull that had forgotten what it was guarding. Lysandra arrived in a single carriage with 2 trunks and a collection of estate management ledgers she had brought from the Ashford territories. The household staff, what remained of them, consisted of an aging steward named Brennan, who walked with a limp and spoke in sentences that suggested he had given up expecting anyone from the main estate to remember they existed, a cook who doubled as the groundskeeper's wife, and 3 servants whose combined enthusiasm could not have filled a thimble. Brennan met her at the gates. He looked at the carriage. He looked at the 2 trunks. He looked at the woman stepping down onto the broken flagstones in traveling boots that were practical rather than decorative, and something shifted behind his weathered eyes. "Your Grace," he said, "we were not expecting, that is, the keep has not been prepared for." "I can see that." Lysandra surveyed the courtyard with the same clinical assessment she had once applied to the struggling Ashford estates. Decay was not unfamiliar to her. Neglect was not frightening. She had spent her entire adult life looking at broken things and calculating what it would take to make them functional. "Show me the accounts," she said. Brennan stared at her. "The accounts? The ledgers? Whatever records exist for the estate's income, expenditures, staffing, and land use. I want them on a table within the hour." "Your Grace, the accounts have not been properly maintained in several years. The Duke's steward stopped sending oversight reports after they decided this place was not worth the ink." Lysandra cut him off without malice, just precision. "I understand. Then we start from zero. Show me the land first. Every field, every outbuilding, every tenant holding that still has breath in it. I want to see what we have before I decide what we need." She walked past him into the keep without waiting for a response. Brennan stood alone in the courtyard for a long moment, looking at the space where she had been standing, trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed with everything he had expected. He had expected a discarded wife. He had received something else entirely. The first month at Stormhollow was brutal. Lysandra walked every acre of the estate in boots that wore through at the soles. She catalogued every broken fence, every silted drainage channel, every field that had gone fallow because no one had bothered to organize a planting rotation. She sat with tenant farmers who had not spoken to anyone from the main house in years and listened to them describe harvests that shrank every season, livestock herds that dwindled, roads that washed out every spring because maintenance had been defunded. She did not complain. She did not write to Caedric. She did not send messages to the capital, or appeal to allies, or do any of the things a wronged duchess was expected to do to signal her displeasure. She worked. The kind of work that does not announce itself. The kind that starts before dawn and ends after dark. The kind that involves sitting at a table by candlelight with columns of numbers that refuse to add up, reworking them again, finding the narrow margin where survival becomes possible if you are willing to be ruthless about waste and patient about recovery. Brennan watched her do this night after night. He watched her eat the same simple meals the staff ate. He watched her meet with local craftsmen about repairing the keep's crumbling outer wall. He watched her negotiate with a merchant caravan that passed through the northern trade road, securing a provisional supply agreement using nothing but the Ravaryn name and the force of her own conviction. One evening, standing in the doorway of the estate office while Lysandra bent over land surveys spread across the desk, he said quietly, "The last person to care about this place was the old Duke's mother. That was 30 years ago." Lysandra did not look up. "Then it has been waiting a long time. You could leave, no one would blame you." Now she looked up. Her eyes were tired. the kind of tired that settles into bone. But behind the exhaustion was something Brennan recognized because he had lived long enough to know what it looked like. Purpose. "Leaving is easy," she said. "Staying is the only thing that changes anything." Brennan nodded once and left her to her work. He did not say what he was thinking, that she reminded him of the old Duchess, that stubbornness and grace were the same thing when you stripped away the decoration, that the Duke of Ravaryn had exiled his greatest asset to a fortress he had forgotten about, and that one day the cost of that mistake would arrive like a storm he never saw coming. Seasons turned, snow buried the moors and then retreated. Lysandra continued her work with the relentless patience of someone who understood that restoration was not an event but a process. Fields were cleared, drainage channels were rebuilt. The tenant farmers slowly and then with growing certainty began to trust the woman who showed up at their doors not with orders but with questions. Word traveled, quietly at first, then louder. The Duchess of Ravaryn was rebuilding Storm Hollow. The rumors reached the capital in fragments. A trade partner mentioned improved grain output from the northern route. A diplomatic courier reported that roads previously impassable were now maintained. A minor lord whose estates bordered the Ravaryn northern territory sent a letter to his cousin in the capital, noting that the Duchess had personally negotiated a water-sharing agreement that resolved a dispute 3 generations old. None of this reached Caedric directly. He had not asked about Lysandra since sending her north. He had not written. He had not visited. In the architecture of his life, Stormhollow Keep occupied the same category as a resolved transaction. Completed, filed, forgotten. His attention remained where it always remained. On the borders, on the trade negotiations, on the political maneuvering that kept the Ravaryn Duchy at the center of imperial power, and on Celestine. Lady Celestine Vane had occupied the vacuum left by Lysandra's exile with the efficiency of water filling a crack in stone. She moved through the Ravaryn household with increasing authority, directing staff, influencing guest lists, appearing at Caedric's side during diplomatic functions with a proprietary confidence that made the court whisper louder than ever. She was beautiful. She was intelligent. She understood the machinery of aristocratic power with an instinct that bordered on predatory. And she had spent 4 years studying Caedric Ravaryn the way a cartographer studies terrain, mapping every vulnerability, every pressure point, every blind spot created by the grief he refused to process. She knew he did not love her. Love was not the currency she traded in. She traded in access, influence, proximity to power. And as long as Lysandra remained invisible in the frozen north, Celestine's position was unassailable. Until the invitation arrived. The Emperor's Winter Ball, the most significant social event of the imperial calendar. Every major house in the realm would attend. Every alliance would be tested, displayed, or quietly renegotiated under crystal chandeliers and the watchful eyes of 1,000 ambitious nobles. Celestine held the invitation in her hands and felt something she had not felt in years. Fear. Because the invitation was addressed to Duke and Duchess Ravaryn, both of them. The Emperor was summoning Lysandra back from exile, publicly, officially, in a manner that could not be refused without diplomatic catastrophe. And Celestine understood, with the cold clarity that had kept her alive in the most dangerous court in the Empire, that everything she had built was about to be tested by the one variable she had never been able to control. The woman she had spent 4 years pretending did not exist. That night, alone in the private wing of the Ravaryn estate, Celestine unlocked the treasury vault with a key she was never supposed to possess. Her hands moved through velvet-lined cases and ancestral silver until her fingers closed around a box she had discovered months ago and memorized the location of with the patience of someone who always planned 3 moves ahead. She opened it. Inside, resting on black silk, the imperial sapphire necklace caught the lamplight and burned blue. The legendary Ravaryn heirloom, the piece that had adorned every duchess for 5 generations. The jewel that the court believed had been lost when Caedric's first wife died. It had not been lost. It had been locked away. Buried with the grief Caedric refused to name. Celestine lifted the necklace from its case. The sapphires were cold against her skin, cold and heavy and magnificent. A duchess's crown. A bloodline's proof. A statement that could not be misread by anyone in the Empire. She clasped it around her throat. And in the mirror, she watched herself become something she had never been. Not a mistress, not a shadow. A claim. 400 miles north, Lysandra Ravaryn stood on the battlements of Storm Hollow Keep, reading the Emperor's invitation by the light of a winter moon. The wind tore at the parchment. The cold bit through her cloak. Below her, the estate she had rebuilt from ruins stretched across the moorland, like proof that patience could outlast punishment. She read the invitation twice. Then she folded it carefully, pressed it against her chest, and stared south toward a world she had not been part of for over a year. Somewhere in that direction, in a palace she had never been welcomed into, a man who had married her and discarded her was about to discover that exile does not erase a person. It sharpens them. The Duchess of Ravaryn was going to the winter ball, and she was not going to ask permission. The carriage from Storm Hollow took 4 days to reach the capital. Lysandra spent most of the journey in silence, watching the landscape shift from frozen moorland to rolling farmland to the dense, smoke-crowned sprawl of the imperial city through windows streaked with frost and road grime. She had brought one trunk, one dress, and a stillness inside her chest that had taken 14 months of exile to build and would need to survive whatever waited at the other end of this road. Brennan had argued against her going, not loudly, not with the blunt force that younger men mistake for persuasion. He had simply stood in the courtyard at dawn while the driver loaded her trunk and said, "The court will try to make you small, Your Grace. That is what courts do to women who arrive without armies." Lysandra had looked at him from the carriage step. "I am not arriving without an army, Brennan. I rebuilt one. It just happens to be made of drainage channels and grain yields instead of soldiers." He had almost smiled. Almost. Now, 300 miles south of that courtyard, the capital rose around her like a monument to everything she had learned to live without. Gilded spires, marble facades, streets crowded with carriages bearing house crests that read like a registry of power, ambition, and inherited entitlement. The air smelled different here, denser, perfumed with coal smoke and expensive flowers, and the faint metallic tang of money changing hands faster than promises. She had not sent word ahead to the Ravaryn estate. She had not written to Caedric. She had come because the Emperor summoned her, and ignoring an imperial summons was not stubbornness. It was suicide. But there was something else driving her south. Something she would not name because naming it would give it power she could not afford to surrender. The truth was simpler and uglier than principle. She wanted to see his face. She wanted to stand in the same room as the man who had married her and mailed her to the edge of the world, and never once asked if she was alive or dead or somewhere in between. She wanted to know if he would look at her the way he looked at a resolved transaction, and she wanted to know what it would feel like when he did. The Ravaryn townhouse in the capital district occupied an entire block of the ambassador's quarter. It was enormous, immaculate, staffed by a small army of servants who operated with the silent efficiency of people trained to anticipate needs before they became requests. Lysandra's carriage pulled up to the main entrance at 4:30 in the afternoon. The head butler, a man named Orwick, whose posture suggested he had been born standing at attention, opened the door and stared at her for a full 3 seconds before his training kicked in. "Your Grace, we were not informed of your arrival." "I gathered." She stepped down. "Is the Duke in residence?" Orwick's composure held, but barely. "His Grace is at the ministry. He is expected to return for the evening. Then I will need a room prepared. Something in the east wing, away from the main apartments." The request was strategic, and they both knew it. The main apartments were Caedric's domain, and if court gossip held any accuracy, the adjacent chambers had been occupied by Celestine Vane for the better part of 4 years. Lysandra had no intention of sleeping within earshot of that arrangement. "Of course, Your Grace. I will see to it immediately." She walked into the house she had never been invited to enter, and the marble floors echoed under her boots like the opening notes of something that could not be taken back. Caedric learned of her arrival the way he learned most things that disrupted his carefully maintained architecture. Through Harlan, who intercepted him in the ministry corridor with the particular expression he reserved for news that was simultaneously inevitable and catastrophic. "She is here." Caedric stopped walking. The corridor was empty. Late afternoon light sliced through tall windows and laid gold bars across the stone floor. "Who?" Your wife. The word landed with a weight that had nothing to do with its two syllables. Caedric's face did not change, but something behind his eyes recalculated, a rapid, involuntary adjustment of every assumption he had built his last 14 months around. When? This afternoon. She took a room in the East Wing. She has not requested an audience. That last detail hit differently than Harlan intended. Caedric absorbed it the way a fortification absorbs a siege stone. Silently. With damage that would not be visible until later. She had not requested an audience. She had simply arrived. Occupied space. Existed in his house without asking permission. The same way she had existed in Storm Hollow, without complaint. The same way she had stood in that drawing room during their first meeting and declined to sit because the conversation did not require it. Has Celestine been informed? Harlan's pause was eloquent. Lady Celestine is currently at the dressmaker's. Her preparations for the winter ball have been extensive. That is not what I asked. No, she has not been informed. I assumed you would prefer to manage that situation yourself. Caedric resumed walking. His stride was measured, controlled. The same mechanical precision he applied to everything. But Harlan, who had known him since before grief had rewired his entire operating system, noticed that the rhythm was slightly off, a fraction of a beat faster than usual. The Duke of Ravaryn was not panicking. Men like Caedric did not panic. But somewhere beneath the iron and the strategy and the 4 years of carefully constructed emotional absence, a door he had sealed shut was rattling on its hinges. He did not go to the East Wing. He went to his study, closed the door, and sat in the dark for 20 minutes without moving. This is what control looks like when it starts to fracture. Not a dramatic collapse, not a visible crack, just a man sitting alone in a room he built specifically so he would never have to feel anything, slowly becoming aware that the walls are not as thick as he believed. Celestine Vane returned to the Ravaryn townhouse at 7 that evening in a cascade of silk packages and dressmakers' boxes, trailing 2 assistants and the satisfied energy of a woman who had spent the day preparing for the most important night of her career. Because that is what the winter ball was to her, not a social event, not an obligation, a career move. 4 years of careful positioning, influence cultivation, and strategic proximity to the most powerful duke in the empire had been building toward this single night. The ball was where alliances crystallized, where power became visible, where the court looked at who stood beside whom and drew conclusions that shaped policy for years. Celestine intended to stand beside Caedric. She intended to wear the imperial sapphire, and she intended for every noble in the empire to understand, without a single word being spoken, that the Duchess of Ravaryn was a formality and she was the reality. She was halfway up the main staircase when Orwick intercepted her. Lady Celestine, a moment if you please. Not now, Orwick. I need these boxes in my chambers and I need hot water drawn within the hour. The Duchess has arrived. Celestine's foot stopped on the stair. The assistants behind her went still with the instinctive caution of people who recognize the moment before an explosion. I beg your pardon. Duchess Ravaryn arrived this afternoon. She has taken a room in the East Wing. Celestine's fingers tightened on the banister. The wood creaked under her grip. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, something raw and uncontrolled moved behind her eyes. Not shock. She was too disciplined for shock, but a flash of the animal beneath the polish. The survival mechanism that had kept her alive and climbing in a court where women without titles were consumed and discarded like seasonal decorations. Then it was gone, replaced by the smooth, calculated composure that was her most dangerous weapon. Thank you, Orwick. That will be all. She continued up the stairs without breaking stride. The assistants followed. The silk packages rustled against the banister like whispered conspiracies. In her chambers, with the door locked and the assistants dismissed, Celestine stood before the mirror and breathed. Slow, deliberate. The way a fighter breathes between rounds. She had always known this moment would come, not the specific timing, but the inevitability. The wife returns. The court watches. The mistress is weighed and measured against the woman who holds the actual title, and the outcome of that measurement determines everything. She had prepared for this the way she prepared for everything, with precision, with intelligence, with the ruthless understanding that in a world built on appearance, the woman who controls the visual narrative controls the outcome. Her eyes moved to the locked cabinet in the corner of the room. Inside it, Wrapped in velvet and hidden beneath correspondence she would burn before allowing anyone to read, sat the imperial sapphire necklace, her insurance policy, her claim. The ball was tomorrow night. The Duchess had arrived without announcement, without preparation, without the elaborate wardrobe and political machinery that a proper court appearance required. She was a woman from the frozen north showing up to the most important event of the year with whatever she had packed in a single trunk. Celestine had spent weeks preparing. She had the dress. She had the alliances. She had 4 years of established presence in Caedric's household and the social architecture of the capital. And she had the sapphire. She unlocked the cabinet, lifted the necklace from its hiding place, held it against her throat, and watched the stones catch lamplight until they burned like trapped pieces of winter sky. Tomorrow night, the Empire would see who truly belonged beside the Duke of Ravaryn, and it would not be the woman he had thrown away. The morning of the winter ball, Caedric finally went to the East Wing. He told himself it was strategic. The Emperor's ball required both Duke and Duchess to appear together. Protocol demanded coordination. It was logistics, not sentiment, that drove him down the corridor at 9 a.m. with coffee he had not finished and a jaw clenched tight enough to ache. He knocked once. Lysandra opened the door herself. No servant, no intermediary. Just the woman standing in a plain white linen shirt with her dark hair pulled back and ink stains on her fingers from what appeared to be correspondence she had been writing at the small desk by the window. She looked at him. He looked at her. 14 months of absence collapsed into a single moment of recognition, and Caedric discovered something he had not anticipated. She looked different, not thinner, though she was, not harder, though that too. The difference was in her eyes. The woman who had stood in that drawing room during their negotiation had been composed and direct and unafraid. The woman standing before him now was all of those things, but there was something else, something beneath the surface that looked like it had been forged rather than inherited. The quiet confidence of someone who had been tested and had not broken. "You are here," he said. "I am." "The Emperor's invitation." "Yes." "You should have sent word." "To whom?" The question was not hostile, it was genuine. She asked it the way someone asks for directions to a place they have never been told exists. To whom, exactly, should she have sent word? The husband who had not contacted her in 14 months? The household staff who answered to his mistress? The court that had been trained to forget she existed? Caedric's jaw worked. The muscle beneath his ear pulsed once. Tonight. The ball. We will need to arrive together. I assumed as much. Have you brought appropriate attire? Something flickered across her face. Not offense. Something older and more tired than offense. The particular exhaustion of a woman being asked about her wardrobe by a man who had never asked about her survival. I will manage. He stood there a moment longer. The corridor stretched behind him, lined with portraits of Ravaryn ancestors who had built their legacy on conquest and control, and the absolute certainty that strength was the only currency that mattered. He had been raised to believe that. He had structured his entire existence around it. And standing in this doorway, looking at a woman who had rebuilt a ruined estate with nothing but patience and will, he felt the first hairline fracture in that belief spread through his chest like ice cracking on a frozen river. He did not acknowledge it. 8 o'clock, he said. The main hall. He turned and walked away. His footsteps were steady, measured, the same controlled rhythm he applied to everything. But his hands were not quite steady, and he did not look back, because looking back would mean admitting that the woman he had discarded had become someone he could not dismiss. That admission would come, but not yet, not until the sapphire. Evening descended on the capital like a velvet curtain falling across a stage that had been set for catastrophe. Blackthorn Palace blazed. Every window burned with candlelight that turned the ancient stone facade into something alive and shimmering against the winter darkness. Carriages lined the approach road for a quarter-mile, each one bearing a house crest, each one delivering its occupants into a night that would reshape the political landscape of the empire before sunrise. Inside the grand ballroom, 1,000 crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across marble floors polished to a mirror finish. The empire's aristocracy circulated in waves of silk and jewels and barely concealed ambition, each conversation a negotiation, each smile a calculation, each glass of champagne raised in a toast that meant something entirely different than the words spoken over it. Caedric arrived at the main hall at precisely 8 o'clock. He wore black. He always wore black. It was not affectation. It was elimination of variables. Black required no decisions. It projected authority without effort. It made other men's elaborate court dress look like costumes. Lysandra met him at the foot of the staircase. She wore dark blue. Nearly midnight, a gown of heavy silk that moved like water when she walked, unadorned except for a single silver clasp at the shoulder. No jewels. No embellishment. In a court where women armored themselves in gemstones and gold thread, she had arrived in the visual equivalent of a clean blade. Caedric looked at her and said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not crack something open. They rode to Blackthorn Palace in the same carriage. The silence between them was not hostile. It was structural. It sat between their bodies like a wall built from everything unsaid over 14 months of absence. The occasional jolt of the carriage over cobblestones was the only thing that moved. Once, their shoulders touched when the carriage rounded a sharp corner. The contact lasted less than a second. Caedric shifted away immediately. Lysandra did not react, but she noticed. She noticed the way he moved, like a man avoiding a wound he had not admitted to having. The ballroom swallowed them whole. The moment they entered, every eye in the room performed the rapid, predatory assessment that aristocrats disguise as polite acknowledgement. Duke Ravaryn and his Duchess, together, in public, for the first time since a wedding that the court had already filed under political convenience. They moved through the crowd like two planets sharing an orbit, but generating no warmth between them. Caedric exchanged greetings with ambassadors and ministers with the practiced ease of a man who could weaponize small talk. Lysandra stood beside him and contributed precisely what was required. Nothing more. But the court noticed. They noticed that she was composed, that she was present, that she did not cling to his arm or defer to his conversation or perform any of the decorative submission that was expected of a duchess at her first major court appearance. They noticed that she stood like someone who belonged there because she had decided to belong there, not because anyone had given her permission, and they began to whisper. The whispers died when Lady Celestine Vane descended the grand staircase. It was choreographed, every step, every angle of light, every calculated pause that allowed the fabric of her ivory gown to catch the chandelier's fire and reflect it back like a woman wreathed in flame. She had spent weeks preparing for this entrance, and the preparation showed with the polish of something designed to dominate. But it was not the gown that stopped the room. It was the necklace. The imperial sapphire necklace blazed against Celestine's throat like captured lightning. The stones were enormous, deep blue bleeding into violet at their centers, surrounded by diamonds that multiplied every flicker of candlelight into a constellation. It was the most recognizable piece of jewelry in the empire. Every noble in the room knew its history. Every noble knew which family it belonged to. Every noble knew that it had been considered lost since the death of Caedric's first wife. And every noble could see, with the immediate clarity of people trained from birth to read power through its symbols, exactly what Celestine was declaring by wearing it. I am the Duchess in everything but name. This necklace proves it. The real wife is a ghost from the frozen north, and I am the woman who matters. The ballroom held its breath. Celestine reached the bottom of the staircase and moved through the crowd with the absolute confidence of a woman who believed she had already won. Courtiers parted for her. Women stared at the sapphire with a mixture of envy and alarm. Men calculated the political implications with the speed of people whose survival depended on reading shifts in power before the dust settled. She crossed the ballroom toward Caedric. He was standing with the Vaemont ambassador near the eastern windows. Lysandra was 6 feet to his left, speaking with a minor lord whose name she had learned that morning and whose grain concern she had studied in the carriage. Celestine stopped 3 paces from Caedric, close enough to claim proximity, far enough to force him to close the distance if he wanted to. Your Grace, her voice carried exactly the right blend of intimacy and deference, the tone of a woman who knew how to navigate the gap between public decorum and private history. You look well. Caedric's eyes found the necklace. For 2 seconds, nothing moved in his face. Nothing at all. The stillness was total, complete, the kind of absence of expression that and a man who controlled everything signaled the precise moment when control was being tested to its absolute limit. He knew that necklace. He knew every stone. He knew the weight of it because he had clasped it around another woman's neck years ago, in another lifetime, when he was still capable of touching someone without calculating the strategic value of the gesture. He had locked it away after the funeral. He had never told anyone where, which meant Celestine had found it herself, which meant she had searched, which meant this was not impulse. This was strategy. "You're wearing the Ravaryn sapphire," he said. His voice was level, quiet. The kind of quiet that every servant in the household had learned to recognize as the most dangerous sound their master could produce. Celestine smiled. It seemed appropriate for the occasion. Across the ballroom, Lysandra turned. She did not hear the exchange. She did not need to. She saw the necklace from 30 feet away, and the recognition was immediate. Not because she had ever worn it, not because she had ever seen it in person, but because every duchess in the empire knew the imperial sapphire by reputation, and every woman who had married into the Ravaryn bloodline understood exactly what it represented: lineage, legitimacy, belonging. And someone who was none of those things was wearing it in front of the entire court. Lysandra's expression did not change. Her posture did not shift. But something behind her eyes went very still, the same stillness that had settled over Stormhollow Keep in the dead of winter, when the wind dropped and the moors went silent and the world held its breath before the storm. She set down her glass. She excused herself from the minor lord, and she began to walk. The crowd felt her before they saw her. There was a change in the atmospheric pressure of the room, the subtle shift that occurs when someone moves with intention through a space designed for performance. Heads turned. Conversations faltered mid-syllable. The string quartet in the gallery above played on, but the music became irrelevant because the ballroom had found a different frequency. Lysandra crossed the floor. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She moved with the measured, unhurried certainty of a woman who had spent 14 months rebuilding a ruin and understood that the most important structures are the ones you construct when no one is watching. She reached Celestine. They stood facing each other for the first time, the mistress and the wife, the woman who had claimed the sapphire and the woman it belonged to. Between them, the entire political and emotional architecture of the Ravaryn duchy balanced on a point so fine it could draw blood. The ballroom went silent. Lysandra looked at the necklace. She looked at Celestine. And then she did something that no one in that room, not the ministers, not the ambassadors, not the emperor himself watching from his private balcony, had anticipated. She spoke calmly. The imperial sapphire has a hidden seal inside the clasp setting. It was placed there by the third Duchess of Ravaryn as a security measure and has been known only to members of the ducal bloodline. Lysandra's voice carried across the silent ballroom with the clarity of someone who did not need volume to command attention. I would like to request that the Imperial Jewel Master examine the piece. If the seal is present, the necklace's provenance is confirmed. If it is not, then Lady Celestine has nothing to fear. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the sound of every calculation in the room being rewritten at once. Celestine's face held. The smile remained. The composure remained. But beneath the surface, behind the eyes that had navigated the most treacherous court in the empire for 4 years without flinching, something fundamental shifted. She had not known about the seal. She had prepared for accusations, for emotional outbursts, for the predictable response of a wronged wife confronting her husband's mistress in public. She had rehearsed her counters, her deflections, her elegant pivots that would transform any attack into evidence of Lysandra's desperation. She had not prepared for evidence. The Imperial Jewel Master was summoned from the Eastern Gallery. He was an elderly man with steady hands and the particular authority that comes from decades of handling objects worth more than most people's lives. He approached Celestine with professional courtesy and asked, with the quiet formality of someone who understood that the next 60 seconds would determine the political future of several noble houses, if he might examine the clasp. Celestine could not refuse. Refusing would be admission. She stood perfectly still while the craftsman turned the necklace's clasp between his fingers, angled it toward the light, and studied the hidden mechanism with the careful attention of a man whose professional reputation depended on getting this exactly right. The ballroom waited. Caedric watched from 4 paces away. His face was unreadable. His hands were at his sides. But inside his chest, something was happening that he had no framework for processing. The woman he had exiled to a frozen fortress was standing in the center of the Empire's most powerful gathering and dismantling his mistress's power play with the same quiet competence she had used to rebuild drainage channels and negotiate water-sharing agreements. She was not performing outrage. She was not performing victimhood. She was performing proof. And proof was the one thing Celestine's carefully constructed world had no defense against. The Jewel Master straightened. He turned to the room. His voice was measured and carried the weight of professional certainty. The Ravaryn seal is present. 3 words. They detonated across the ballroom like cannon fire. The necklace was genuine. The necklace was Ravaryn property. The necklace was on the throat of a woman who had no legal, hereditary, or marital right to wear it, which meant it had been taken, which meant Lady Celestine Vane, the Duke of Ravaryn's mistress, had stolen from the ducal treasury. In public, before the Emperor, before every noble house in the realm. The whispers became a roar. Every alliance in the room recalculated. Every political relationship that had accommodated Celestine's influence suddenly discovered that accommodation was a liability. The court's social machinery, so carefully calibrated to accept her presence as an unofficial reality, ground to a halt and began spinning in the opposite direction. Celestine's composure cracked. Not visibly, not in any way that an untrained eye would catch. But the people in that ballroom were not untrained. They were predators in silk, and they smelled the shift the way wolves smell a change in wind. She turned to Caedric. Her eyes sought his with the desperate precision of someone reaching for a lifeline they had always assumed would be there. What she found was worse than anger, worse than betrayal, worse than the cold fury of a man whose authority had been challenged in the most public arena in the Empire. She found clarity. For the first time in 4 years, Caedric Ravaryn was looking at Celestine Vane and seeing exactly what she was. Not the beauty, not the intelligence, not the strategic value or the physical comfort or the familiar presence that had filled the void left by grief without ever actually healing it. He saw the hunger, the architecture of need disguised as devotion, the machinery of ambition wrapped in the language of loyalty. The fundamental, irreducible truth that Celestine had never loved him. She had loved what proximity to him provided. And the moment that proximity was threatened, she had reached for the one weapon she believed would guarantee her position. A dead woman's necklace. Caedric looked at Celestine. Then he looked at Lysandra, the wife he had discarded, standing in a simple gown with no jewels and no allies, who had just dismantled the most dangerous woman in the Empire with nothing but knowledge and composure. One had stolen power, the other had built it. The recognition hit him like a blade between the ribs, not because it was new, because he had known it, somewhere beneath the grief and the control and the deliberate numbness he had mistaken for strength, since the moment Lysandra Ashford stood in a drawing room and refused to sit down. He had married the right woman, and he had thrown her away. The ballroom burned with whispered fury. Ministers exchanged glances. Ambassadors excused themselves to send urgent dispatches. The Emperor's personal secretary appeared at the edge of the gallery and began taking notes with the focused intensity of someone recording history in real time. And in the center of it all, Celestine felt the ground beneath her crumbling. She had one card left, one weapon she had kept in reserve against exactly this kind of catastrophe. Documents gathered over years, correspondence, financial records, evidence of corruption that ran through the imperial court like rot through timber. She had accumulated it as insurance, protection against the day when Caedric's loyalty finally wavered. That day had arrived, and Celestine, cornered and desperate and operating on the survival instinct of a woman who understood that mercy was a luxury she had never been offered, made the decision that would set the Empire on fire. She reached into the silk fold of her gown and produced a sealed leather portfolio. "If the court wishes to discuss theft," she said, and her voice had changed now, stripped of its practiced warmth, revealing the steel and the calculation and the raw, unvarnished ambition underneath, "then let us discuss all of it." She held the portfolio toward the imperial secretary. Every name, every transaction, every minister in this room who has sold influence, traded favors, or lined their pockets with imperial funds. I have documented it all." The ballroom went nuclear. Caedric's hand closed around Celestine's wrist before she could extend the portfolio fully. His grip was iron. His eyes were something beyond fury. "You would burn everything," he said, low enough that only she could hear. "You would burn the entire court to save yourself." Celestine looked at him with eyes that held nothing left to lose. "You taught me that. You taught me that survival is the only thing that matters. I was an excellent student." She pulled her wrist free, and she handed the documents to the Imperial Secretary. The point of no return did not announce itself. It did not arrive with trumpets or declarations or the dramatic flourish that storytellers invent to mark the moment when everything changes. It arrived in the sound of a leather portfolio changing hands, and the silence that followed was the sound of an empire holding its breath before the fall. The Imperial Secretary's name was Aldrich Thorn, and he had served the throne for 23 years without once allowing his hands to tremble while handling state documents. Tonight, standing in the center of the Empire's grandest ballroom, with Celestine Vane's leather portfolio pressed against his chest, and 1,000 aristocratic eyes boring into him like heated iron, his hands were steady. The rest of him was not. He looked to the Emperor's balcony. A subtle nod descended from the shadows above. Permission. The kind that carries the weight of a civilization behind it, because when the Emperor permits a document to be opened in public, he is not granting a favor. He is detonating a controlled explosion and watching to see which buildings remain standing. Thorn broke the seal. The first page was a ledger. Names, dates, sums. Transactions recorded with the meticulous precision of someone who understood that evidence is only useful if it is irrefutable. The handwriting was not Celestine's. It was cleaner, more practiced. The penmanship of a trained administrative hand. Thorn read the first 3 entries in silence. His face changed, not dramatically, just the faintest tightening around the eyes, the slight compression of the lips that a man develops after 2 decades of reading documents that end careers and occasionally end lives. He turned the page. More names, more transactions. A web of financial transfers stretching across 8 noble houses, 14 ministry officials, and 3 members of the Imperial Treasury. Bribes disguised as trade commissions. Land transfers buried in agricultural subsidy paperwork, tax revenues diverted through shell accounts that existed only on paper and vanished the moment anyone looked too closely. The corruption was not petty, it was architectural. Someone had built a parallel financial system inside the Empire's legitimate governance structure, siphoning wealth and influence with the patience and precision of an engineer rerouting a river 1 stone at a time. Thorn looked up from the documents. His eyes found the Emperor's balcony again. This time the nod was slower, heavier. "Read the names," came the voice from above. Quiet, carrying the particular authority of a man who does not need volume because he has armies. Thorn cleared his throat. The first name belonged to Lord Mercer, Minister of Trade. A man currently standing 14 feet away with a champagne flute frozen halfway to his lips, and a complexion rapidly transitioning from aristocratic pallor to something closer to parchment. The second name was Baron Aldenmere, Treasury Oversight. He was already moving toward the exit when 2 Imperial guards materialized from the crowd and placed themselves between him and the doors with the silent efficiency of men who had done this before. The third name was Lady Hargrove, Diplomatic Corps. She did not run. She closed her eyes and stood very still, the way a person stands when they have been expecting something terrible for a long time and are almost relieved when it finally arrives. The fourth name. The fifth. The sixth. Each one a detonation. Each one a reputation collapsing in real time, dragging alliances and loyalties and carefully constructed political architectures down with it like a chain of buildings crumbling into each other. The ballroom became a theater of controlled destruction. Caedric watched it happen from the eye of the storm. He stood exactly where he had been standing when Celestine produced the portfolio, and he had not moved. Not one step. His body was rigid. His face was carved from the same expressionless stone that had served him through 4 years of court politics and grief management and the systematic elimination of every emotion that might compromise his capacity to function. But behind that stone, something was collapsing. Because as the names continued to fall, as the web of corruption spread across the ballroom like cracks across ice, A pattern was emerging that Caedric's strategic mind could not ignore, no matter how desperately it wanted to. The transactions ran through Ravaryn accounts, not his personal accounts, not the duchy's primary treasury, but subsidiary accounts, trade commission funds, border maintenance budgets, infrastructure allocations for the northern territories. Money that had been earmarked for roads and grain stores and the maintenance of estates like Stormhollow Keep, diverted and rerouted through a labyrinth of false ledgers so complex that only someone with intimate access to the duchy's full financial architecture could have constructed it. Someone inside his own house. The realization did not hit Caedric all at once. It arrived in stages, the way a building does not collapse in a single moment, but rather fails at its load-bearing points one by one until the structure can no longer support its own weight. First the subsidiary accounts, then the routing patterns, then the administrative access required to create and maintain the false ledger system without detection, then the handwriting. He had seen it on thousands of documents, budget reports, diplomatic briefings, strategic assessments, correspondence that he had read and signed and filed away with the absolute confidence of a man who trusted the hand that wrote them because that hand had been at his side for 15 years. Caedric turned to find Harlan Drace in the crowd. Harlan was not there. The space where his chief advisor had been standing 6 minutes ago was empty. A void in the sea of horrified aristocrats that announced itself with the particular silence of a man who had calculated his exit strategy before the first name was read. Because he had known what was in the documents. He had always known. The understanding arrived in Caedric's chest like a fist closing around his windpipe. Not anger. Not yet. Anger requires processing, and what Caedric was experiencing had not yet reached the stage where processing was possible. This was something more primitive, more physical. The animal shock of a man who has just discovered that the ground he built his fortress on was hollow the entire time. Harlan, his advisor, his oldest friend, the man who had stood beside him at his first wife's funeral and watched him grieve and helped him rebuild and counseled him on every major decision for a decade and a half, the man who had suggested the marriage to Lysandra, the man who had managed the duchy's finances during Caedric's obsessive focus on border disputes and political positioning, the man who had access to every vault, every ledger, every subsidiary account, every hidden mechanism of the Ravaryn financial machine, the man who had been stealing from him for years. Caedric's breathing changed, not visibly, but internally the rhythm that had governed his body since childhood, the controlled, measured cadence that he relied on the way a clock relies on its mainspring, stuttered, skipped a beat, recovered, stuttered again. He turned to the nearest Imperial Guard. "Lord Drace, find him, now!" The guard moved, others followed. The palace's exit points were being sealed as the arrests continued, but Harlan Drace was not an amateur, and he had 15 years of intimate knowledge of every corridor, staircase, and service passage in the Imperial capital. Caedric stood in the wreckage of his own certainty and tried to think. Strategy, containment, damage assessment, the familiar mechanisms that had always carried him through crisis. But the mechanisms were grinding against something they had never encountered before. Not an external threat, not a rival duke or a hostile trading partner, or a political enemy whose motives could be mapped and countered. This was the inside of his own architecture breaking apart. Every decision Harlan had influenced, every strategic direction he had shaped, every piece of counsel he had offered over 15 years of what Caedric had believed was unconditional loyalty, all of it now contaminated, all of it suspect. Every memory of trust rewritten in a single stroke by the revelation that the hand he had relied on most completely was the hand that had been reaching into his treasury the entire time. A man builds walls to keep out enemies. He fortifies borders. He arms garrisons. He develops intelligence networks and trade leverage and the capacity for controlled violence that deters aggression before it begins. He does all of this because the fundamental operating assumption of power is that threats come from outside. No one teaches you what to do when the threat has been sitting across your breakfast table for 15 years, pouring your coffee and planning your ruin. Lysandra appeared at his side. He did not know when she had crossed the ballroom. He did not know how long she had been standing there. But she was close enough that he could hear her breathing, and the sound of it, steady, measured, the breathing of a woman who had survived worse than this and knew the difference between a crisis and a catastrophe, cut through the noise in his head like a blade through static. "The Northern accounts," she said. Quiet, direct, no preamble. "The fund allocations for Storm Hollow and the surrounding territories. They were supposed to be maintained through the duchy's infrastructure budget. When I arrived, there was nothing. No maintenance funds, no supply chain support, no staffing allocations. I rebuilt everything from the estate's agricultural revenue because the central funding had been completely severed." Caedric looked at her, really looked at her. The way a man looks at someone when every other reference point in his life has just been revealed as a lie, and the only thing left standing is the person he tried hardest to ignore. "You knew." "I did not know who. I knew the money was gone. I assumed it was neglect." "It was not neglect. No, it was not." They stood together in the center of a ballroom that was rapidly transforming from a social event into a judicial proceeding. Imperial guards moved through the crowd with purpose now, separating the named from the unnamed, the compromised from the merely terrified. Ministers who had smiled and traded favors an hour ago were being escorted through side doors with the grim efficiency of a machine that has been waiting for exactly this excuse to operate at full capacity. Celestine stood alone near the eastern windows. The sapphire necklace still burned at her throat, but its power had inverted. An hour ago it had been a claim of authority. Now it was evidence. She watched the destruction she had unleashed with an expression that held neither triumph nor regret, just the flat, exhausted acknowledgement of a woman who had pulled the pin on a grenade and understood that the blast radius included herself. She had never intended for the documents to surface this way. The portfolio had been insurance, leverage, a quiet weapon meant to be brandished in private, a whispered threat to keep Caedric dependent on her silence. She had accumulated the evidence over 4 years, carefully, methodically, always with the understanding that knowledge is only powerful when it is possessed, not when it is revealed. But Lysandra's move with the sapphire had backed her into a corner where quiet weapons were useless. The entire court had just watched her exposed as a thief. Her reputation, her influence, her access to Caedric's household and the power it provided, all of it incinerated in the time it took an elderly jeweler to confirm a hidden seal. And in that moment of pure survival panic, she had done what cornered animals do. She had bitten everything within reach, including herself. An imperial adjutant approached Caedric with the controlled urgency of someone delivering news that cannot wait for a convenient moment, because convenient moments no longer exist. "Your Grace." Lord Drace was intercepted at the northern gate. He is being held in the palace guard chamber. Caedric's jaw set. The muscle beneath his ear worked once, twice. His body was processing what his mind had not yet fully metabolized, the physical machinery of rage engaging before the emotional architecture could catch up. "Take me to him." The guard chamber beneath Blackthorn Palace was built for function, not comfort. Stone walls, iron fixtures. A single table bolted to the floor with 2 chairs facing each other across a surface scarred by decades of difficult conversations. The lamp overhead cast the kind of light that makes shadows sharper and lies harder to maintain. Harlan Drace sat in one of the chairs with his hands flat on the table and his coat removed and his face wearing the peculiar calm of a man who has been running one set of calculations for years and has just been forced to accept that the final answer was always going to look exactly like this. Caedric entered the room and closed the door behind him. The sound of the lock engaging was small and absolute. They looked at each other across 15 years of shared history and the ruins of everything that history had meant. "How long?" Caedric's voice was stripped. No inflection, no modulation, just the raw structural minimum of language forced through a throat that felt like it had been lined with broken glass. Harlan met his eyes. 11 years. The number hung in the air between them like a body on a rope. 11 years. Caedric had inherited the duchy 14 years ago. Harlan had been stealing from him for 11 of those 14 years. Since before the first wife. Since before the grief. Since before the transformation from a young duke into the cold, controlled machine that the Empire had learned to fear. Almost from the beginning. The Northern Territories. Caedric's hands were on the table now, both of them, pressed flat, the knuckles white. The infrastructure funding that vanished, the maintenance budgets that were never allocated, Storm Hollow, all of it, yes. The grain shortages, the trade route failures, the flooding damage that was never repaired because the repair funds had been diverted. Yes. People starved, Harlan. Harlan's composure shifted. Not much. A fractional tightening of the mouth. The faintest flicker of something that might have been shame, if shame were still a functional component of his emotional architecture. The Northern Territories were strategically expendable. You believed that yourself. You were so focused on the southern borders and the capital and the political positioning that you never once audited the accounts I managed. Not once in 11 years. Because I trusted you. Yes. That was the vulnerability I exploited. The honesty was savage. Not confessional, not remorseful, clinical. Harlan delivered the truth the way a surgeon delivers a diagnosis. Here is the pathology. Here is the mechanism. Here is the reason you are bleeding. Caedric stared at him. The man across the table was simultaneously the most familiar face in his life and a complete stranger. Every shared meal, every strategic session, every moment of counsel that had shaped Caedric's decisions for over a decade, all of it recontextualized, all of it poisoned by the knowledge that the advisor had been building a personal fortune from the wreckage of the territories he was supposed to protect. Why? Because I could. Because the system allowed it. Because you built your entire operation around control, but you never controlled the one thing that mattered most. You never controlled who had access to the machine. You trusted me because I was useful. You kept me close because I was competent. And you never once questioned my loyalty because loyalty was the one variable you could not calculate, so you assumed it instead. Every word was a blade, and every blade found its mark because every word was true. Caedric had built an empire on control. He had controlled borders and trade routes and political alliances, and even his own grief, burying it so deep beneath strategy and ambition that he could function as if it did not exist. He had controlled everything external with an efficiency that terrified his rivals and impressed the emperor. But he had never controlled the people closest to him. He had never verified trust. He had never questioned the foundations because questioning the foundations would have required him to admit that foundations can fail, and admitting that would have meant acknowledging that he was not as invulnerable as he needed to believe. Harlan had not betrayed a strong man. He had exploited a blind one. The marriage, Caedric's voice was different now, lower, rougher. The polished command tone stripped away to reveal something underneath that sounded like a man talking through a wound. You arranged the marriage to Lysandra. You recommended the Ashford alliance. Yes. Why? Because the Ashford territory was the last major piece of the Eastern Trade Corridor. Controlling it through a marriage alliance gave the duchy strategic access to 3 deep-water ports and the grain routes that connect them. The financial potential was enormous. Financial potential that you intended to exploit. The marriage also served as a distraction. Your attention shifted to the political implications. The court focused on the new duchess and the gossip about Celestine. No one looked at the accounts. And sending Lysandra to Storm Hollow. My suggestion. You do not remember because I framed it as your idea. I told you the northern estates needed oversight, that the duchess could serve a useful function managing remote territories while you focused on the capital. What I needed was to keep her away from the financial records at the main estate. A competent woman with estate management experience living in the same household as your accounts would have been dangerous. Caedric pushed back from the table. The chair scraped stone. He stood. He walked to the wall. He pressed his palms against the cold surface and breathed. Every architecture has a failure point. Every system, no matter how carefully constructed, contains the seed of its own collapse. The question is never whether the failure will come. The question is whether the structure can be rebuilt after it does, or whether the collapse is total and permanent, and the only option left is to walk away from the rubble and start digging new foundations with bleeding hands. Caedric pressed his forehead against the stone. It was cold, real. The only thing in the room that was not lying to him. Harlan had orchestrated everything. The marriage, the exile, the financial bleeding of the northern territories, the careful misdirection that kept Caedric focused on external threats. while the most dangerous threat in his life sat across his desk every morning offering counsel that was designed to serve one purpose, keeping the Duke blind. And Caedric had been blind, willingly, gratefully, because blindness was easier than the alternative, because trust was simpler than verification, because the grief of losing his first wife had not just frozen his heart, it had frozen his capacity to question the people who remained. He had traded vulnerability for armor, traded intimacy for control, traded the messy, dangerous, unpredictable work of genuine human connection for the clean efficiency of transactional relationships. And the one transaction he never audited was the one that destroyed him. "The documents Celestine released," Caedric said without turning from the wall. "She did not compile them herself." "No, she found fragments over the years, but the bulk of the documentation was assembled by my network. Ministers and treasury officials I had recruited. They kept records as insurance against each other. Celestine discovered the cache when she was searching the household archives for evidence to use against Lysandra. So she stumbled into your operation. She stumbled into the edges of it. She did not understand the full scope. She believed the corruption was isolated to a few ministers. She did not know it ran through me. She did not know I had been operating inside your household for 11 years. Does she know now? She will when the investigators connect the routing patterns. My name is in those documents, Caedric, buried, layered under intermediaries and false accounts. But it is there. I always knew that. I always calculated the odds of discovery against the returns." Caedric turned from the wall. His face was something beyond fury now, beyond the cold control that had defined him for years. The mask had not just cracked, it had been removed entirely, and what was underneath was a man who looked like he had been dismantled from the inside. "You stood beside me at her funeral." The words came out raw, jagged, not a strategic statement, not a calculated move, just the truth bleeding through the wreckage of 15 years of assumed loyalty. Harlan had stood beside him while they lowered his first wife into the ground. He had placed his hand on Caedric's shoulder and said nothing, because nothing was the correct amount of words for that moment. And 3 years before that moment, he had already begun stealing from the man whose grief he would later witness and use as cover for his continued operation. Harlan looked at him. For the first time, something moved behind his composed expression that resembled an honest emotion, not regret. Harlan was not built for regret, but recognition. The acknowledgement that some costs, even when calculated in advance, feel different when they come due. "I did," he said. Caedric stared at him for a long time. The lamp flickered. The shadows jumped and resettled. Somewhere above them, an empire was reshaping itself around the detonation Celestine had triggered, and the aftershocks would continue for months, maybe years, rearranging power structures and destroying alliances and creating vacuums that ambitious men would fight to fill. But in this room, the only thing that mattered was the space between two men who had shared 15 years of proximity and not one honest moment between them. "Get him out of my sight," Caedric said to the guards at the door. He left the chamber and walked the palace corridors alone. The stone walls echoed with his footsteps and with the distant sounds of controlled chaos from the ballroom above. Arrests, confrontations, the mechanical noise of an empire processing its own corruption. He found Lysandra in the palace's eastern courtyard. She was standing beside a dormant fountain, her arms crossed against the cold, her breath visible in the winter air. She had left the ballroom at some point during the chaos and found this quiet space the way she found everything, by moving towards stillness instead of away from noise. She turned when she heard his footsteps. He stopped 10 feet from her. The distance felt deliberate even though it was not. It was the distance at which his body had learned to maintain separation from anything that might require him to feel something uncontrolled. "It was Harlan," he said. Lysandra's expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted, a recognition that was not surprise because she had spent 14 months in the ruins of his negligence, and she had always known, on some level that survived below conscious thought, that negligence on that scale was not accidental. 11 years, he continued. The northern accounts, the infrastructure funding, the reason Storm Hollow was a ruin when you arrived. All of it was him. The courtyard was silent except for the wind moving through bare branches overhead. Lysandra looked at him the way she had looked at the broken drainage channels and the crumbling outer walls and the neglected tenant farms of Storm Hollow. With assessment, with calculation, with the unflinching clarity of someone who sees damage and immediately begins mapping the work required to repair it. "The duchy's exposure," she said. "How deep?" "I do not know yet. Deep enough to compromise the Treasury's subsidiary accounts. Deep enough to implicate allies I believed were secure." The Northern Restoration. The grain yields, the trade agreements, the infrastructure I rebuilt over the past year. That revenue is clean. I managed every account personally. None of it runs through the central system Harlan controlled. Caedric absorbed this. The weight of it, the scope of what she was telling him. While he had been positioning himself in the capital, managing alliances and political leverage and the elaborate performance of power that the court demanded, she had been building a financial foundation that was now the only uncorrupted revenue stream in the entire duchy. The estate he had used as a dumping ground was now his lifeline. The woman he had discarded was the only person he could trust. "I'm going to need the northern accounts," he said. "All of them. Every ledger, every agreement, every record of expenditure and revenue from the past 14 months. You will have them. And I am going to need you." The words came out before the calculation could stop them. Raw, unprocessed, the kind of statement that Caedric Ravaryn did not make because Caedric Ravaryn did not need people. He used them. He managed them. He maintained them at precisely the distance that maximized their utility while minimizing their capacity to hurt him. But every system he had built for that purpose was in ruins. Every wall he had constructed to protect himself from the vulnerability of needing another person had been demolished from the inside by the one person he had trusted to help maintain them. And standing in this frozen courtyard, stripped of his advisor, his intelligence network, his financial certainty, and the carefully maintained illusion that control could substitute for connection, Caedric Ravaryn was forced to confront the one truth he had spent 4 years burying deeper than any treasury vault. He could not do this alone. He had never been able to do it alone. And the person standing 10 feet away in a simple dark gown with no jewels and no allies, and no reason to help him except a stubbornness that defied every rational calculation he could construct, was the only person in the Empire who had proven, through 14 months of exile and silence and relentless work, that she would stay. Not because she was commanded to, not because she was compensated, not because she had something to gain, because staying was the only thing that changed anything. Lysandra looked at him across 10 feet of frozen courtyard and 5 months of marriage and 14 months of abandonment and the fresh wreckage of everything he thought he knew about his own life. "Then stop pushing me away," she said. Not a plea, not an ultimatum, a condition as clean and non-negotiable as the ones she had laid out in a drawing room a lifetime ago. The Duke of Ravaryn stood in the ruins of his own empire and felt, for the first time in 4 years, the full weight of what it would cost to become someone who deserved the woman in front of him. The cost was everything he had been, and the night was not over. Lysandra's words hung in the frozen courtyard air like a blade suspended between two bodies, and Caedric did not answer them, because answering would have required him to become someone he did not yet know how to be. The silence lasted 4 seconds, maybe 5, long enough for the wind to shift and carry the distant sound of shouting from inside the palace, the chaos of an empire discovering its own rot in real time. Then a palace runner burst through the courtyard archway, breathless, his uniform dark with sweat despite the winter cold. "Your Grace, the Emperor requests your immediate presence in the privy chamber. Lord Drace has made a formal accusation." Caedric's body went still. The particular stillness of a predator registering a threat it did not anticipate. "What accusation?" "Against you, Your Grace. Lord Drace claims you were a knowing participant in the financial network. He has offered testimony in exchange for imperial clemency." The runner delivered this with the mechanical detachment of someone trained to relay information without editorializing, but his eyes betrayed the gravity of what he was carrying. An accusation from the Duke of Ravaryn's own chief advisor, delivered under formal clemency protocol, carried the same destructive potential as the documents Celestine had released. Maybe more, because documents can be disputed. Testimony from a man who sat in the inner circle for 15 years cannot. Lysandra's hand closed around Caedric's forearm. Not gently. The grip was hard and immediate, the instinctive response of a woman who understood political warfare the way farmers understand weather. You do not wait for the storm to arrive. You move before the sky finishes darkening. He is trying to drag you down with him, she said. If your name is attached to the conspiracy, even as an accusation, the Emperor has grounds to seize the duchy pending investigation. Everything. The estates, the treasury, the northern territories. I know what it means. Then move, now, before the testimony calcifies. Caedric looked at her, at the hand on his arm, at the fierce, uncompromising clarity in her eyes. A woman who had spent 14 months in exile, who owed him nothing, who had every reason to let the empire he had built on her abandonment collapse around him. She was not letting it collapse. She was telling him to fight. Something shifted inside Caedric's chest. Not warmth. Not yet. Something harder and more functional than warmth. A recognition that the man he had been for the past 4 years, the isolated, controlling, emotionally cauterized machine that ran the duchy through fear and precision, could not survive what was coming. That version of himself had been designed for a world where the threats were external and the people closest to him were reliable. That world no longer existed. The man who walked into the privy chamber would need to be different, not softer, not weaker, different. The kind of different that happens when you strip away every system you built to avoid feeling things and discover that what is underneath is not the weakness you feared, but something rawer and more dangerous than control ever was. Honesty. He pulled his arm free from Lysandra's grip. Not roughly, just the clean, decisive motion of a man making a choice he cannot take back. "Come with me," he said. It was not a command. It was the first genuine request he had made of another human being in 4 years. Lysandra did not hesitate. She fell into step beside him, and they walked through the palace corridors together, moving against the current of panicked courtiers and rushing guards, 2 people heading toward the center of the explosion while everyone else scrambled for the edges. The privy chamber was the oldest room in Blackthorn Palace. Stone walls 3 feet thick, iron-banded doors that required 2 men to open and 2 men to close. A circular table carved from a single piece of black oak that had witnessed the signing of treaties, the sentencing of traitors, and the private negotiations that shaped the empire's history for 6 generations. The emperor sat at the head of the table. He was a man of 60 with the thin, precise features of someone who had spent a lifetime making decisions that affected millions and had developed the particular economy of expression that comes from understanding that every word, every gesture, every shift of the eyebrow is analyzed by people whose careers depend on interpreting power correctly. To his left sat the imperial chancellor, a woman named Seraine Voss, whose reputation for political acuity was matched only by her reputation for mercilessness. She had built her career on the ruins of people who underestimated her, and she watched Caedric enter the chamber with the focused attention of someone deciding whether to save a burning building or let it fall and build something better on the ashes. To the emperor's right, flanked by 2 imperial guards, sat Harlan Drace. He had been given a chair, a glass of water, the minimal courtesies extended to a man whose testimony is considered valuable enough to preserve. His coat was still removed. His hands were still flat on the table, but his posture had changed since the guard chamber. There was something almost relaxed about him now, the particular looseness of a man who has stopped running and started negotiating. Caedric entered and stopped 6 paces from the table. Lysandra remained 1 step behind him and to his left, a position that was neither submissive nor presumptuous, the placement of someone who intended to be present for every word spoken and every decision made. The emperor spoke first. "Duke Ravaryn, Lord Drace has made serious allegations regarding your involvement in the financial irregularities exposed this evening. You are here to respond." Caedric's eyes moved to Harlan, the man who had counseled him for 15 years, the man who had stolen from him for 11. The man who was now attempting to use that stolen intimacy as a weapon, leveraging 15 years of proximity to construct a narrative in which the Duke was not a victim, but a co-conspirator. It was, Caedric had to admit with the bitter clarity of a man watching his own destruction unfold in real time, brilliant. Harlan's greatest asset had always been his understanding of other people's weaknesses, and Caedric's greatest weakness had always been his obsession with control. A duke who controlled everything could easily be painted as a duke who knew everything. The same isolation that had protected Caedric from emotional vulnerability now made him vulnerable to the most dangerous accusation of all, that he had known. Lord Drace, Caedric addressed him directly. His voice was level, stripped of the diplomatic modulation he usually employed in the presence of the Emperor. This was not a moment for performance. This was a moment for the kind of brutal, unvarnished truth that Caedric had spent 4 years avoiding because unvarnished truth requires a vulnerability he had trained himself to reject. Tell them what you told me an hour ago, in the guard chamber. Tell them you operated for 11 years. Tell them you exploited my trust. Tell them you arranged my marriage, engineered my wife's exile, and diverted the funding that was meant to maintain the duchy's northern infrastructure. Harlan's expression did not change. Everything I did was executed through systems you personally authorized. Every account I accessed bore your seal. Every transfer was processed through channels you established. I am not claiming you designed the corruption, Caedric. I am stating that you created the conditions in which it thrived. You built a machine that ran on control, and then you refused to look inside it because looking inside it would have required admitting it was not perfect. That is not complicity. That is a failure of oversight. In the eyes of imperial law, there is no meaningful distinction. The Chancellor leaned forward. Lord Drace raises a legitimate procedural point. Duke Ravaryn, the financial systems in question operated under your ducal authority. Regardless of your personal knowledge or ignorance, the accountability structure places responsibility at the apex. Caedric felt the trap closing. Felt it the way an animal feels a cage narrowing, not through any single visible mechanism, but through the progressive elimination of space. Harlan had not just stolen money. He had constructed a system in which the theft was architecturally inseparable from Caedric's own governance. Every seal, every authorization, every chain of command that connected the subsidiary accounts to the Duke's central authority. All of it designed so that if the system was ever exposed, the exposure would implicate the man at the top. 11 years of planning, not just theft, insurance. The Emperor's expression was unreadable. He had watched empires fracture over less. He had seen dukes stripped of their titles for accusations far less substantial than what the documentation suggested. And he was not a man who made decisions based on sentiment. He made decisions based on what preserved the stability of the empire, and right now, the most stable outcome might very well be the seizure of the Ravaryn Duchy and the redistribution of its territories to houses that had not just been caught at the center of the largest corruption scandal in a generation. Your Grace? Lysandra's voice cut through the chamber with the clarity of a blade drawn from a sheath. She stepped forward, not past Caedric, beside him. If I may address the council. The Emperor's eyes moved to her. He studied her for a moment. The Duchess of Ravaryn, the woman who had been exiled to a northern ruin and had rebuilt it into the duchy's only remaining clean revenue source. The woman who had exposed Celestine's theft with evidence rather than accusation. The woman who, in a single evening, had demonstrated more strategic competence than half the ministers currently being arrested in the ballroom above. Speak. Lord Drace's accusation rests on the premise that the Duke's governance systems enabled the corruption. This is accurate, but it is only half the architecture. Lysandra's voice was measured, precise. The voice of a woman who had spent 14 months translating estate management into survival strategy and had learned that precision is the only weapon that works against institutional machinery. The same systems also produced a verifiable counter-record. Every diverted fund leaves a gap in the operational budget. Every gap produces a downstream failure. Failed infrastructure, reduced grain yields, deferred maintenance, staffing losses. These failures are documented in the estate records I have maintained at Stormhollow Keep for the past 14 months. She paused. Let the silence work. Let the men and women at the table process the trajectory before she completed it. If the Duke were a knowing participant, the Northern Territories would not have been allowed to deteriorate. A conspirator protects the assets that generate his illicit revenue. He does not starve them. The condition of Stormhollow Keep when I arrived, the complete absence of central funding, the collapse of basic infrastructure, these are not the signatures of a man managing a corruption scheme. They are the signatures of a man who did not know the money was being taken. The chamber went quiet. Harlan's composure held, but something behind his eyes recalculated. He had anticipated many possible defenses, legal arguments, character testimony, political pressure from allied houses. He had not anticipated the woman Caedric had exiled to a frozen fortress, walking into the privy chamber and dismantling his accusation with 14 months of estate ledgers. The Chancellor's eyes narrowed. Not with hostility, with the focused intensity of a mind encountering an argument it had not considered and recognizing that the argument was structurally sound. "You have these records," the Chancellor said. "Every transaction, every expenditure, every revenue line from every tenant farm, trade agreement, and supply contract I negotiated during my time at Stormhollow, all of it independently managed, none of it routed through the central systems Lord Drace controlled. And these records demonstrate the funding gap. They demonstrate it precisely, down to the specific accounts that should have been receiving allocations and the specific dates those allocations ceased. Cross-reference them with the documents Lady Celestine released and the routing patterns in Lord Drace's network, and you will find an exact correlation between the funds diverted and the infrastructure failures I spent 14 months repairing." Caedric stood very still. He was watching Lysandra the way a man watches something he has been looking at for months without actually seeing. She was not defending him out of loyalty. She was not performing the role of dutiful wife rallying to her husband's defense. She was executing a strategic counter-operation with the same methodical precision she had applied to rebuilding drainage channels and negotiating water-sharing agreements. She was saving his duchy, with the work she had done while he was ignoring her. The irony was so complete it almost qualified as justice. "I want those records delivered to the Imperial Auditor within 48 hours, the Emperor said. His voice carried finality, the tone of a man who has heard enough to make a provisional judgment and intends to verify it through the machinery that exists for exactly this purpose. Duke Ravaryn, you are not formally accused, but you are not cleared. Your cooperation in the ongoing investigation will be noted. Lord Drace's testimony will be weighed against the evidence the Duchess has described. I trust I do not need to explain the consequences of any discrepancy." "You do not," Caedric said. "Then this session is concluded. For tonight." The Emperor rose. The Chancellor followed. Guards moved to escort Harlan from the chamber. As he passed Caedric, their eyes met one final time. 15 years of proximity compressed into a single look. Harlan's face held something that was not regret and not triumph. It was recognition. The acknowledgement of a chess player who has played his best move and knows it was not enough. "She is remarkable," Harlan said quietly. "You should have listened to her a year ago." "I should have done a lot of things a year ago." Harlan nodded once and was led from the chamber. The door closed. Caedric and Lysandra stood alone in the oldest room in the Empire, surrounded by stone walls that had witnessed the making and breaking of dynasties, and the silence between them was different now, not hostile, not structural, something else, something that felt like the first tentative breath after a near drowning, raw, desperate, alive. "The records you described," Caedric said, "the northern accounts, the correlation data. They exist. Every word I said was accurate. I know they exist. You do not lie. That is the one thing I have always known about you, even when I refused to know anything else." He paused. His voice was stripped, rough. The polished command tone was gone entirely, and what remained was a man talking through the wreckage of everything he had believed about himself. "You just saved the duchy." "I saved what I built. The duchy happened to be attached to it." Something that was almost a sound escaped Caedric's throat. Not a laugh, not quite, but the ghost of one. The phantom of an emotion he had not experienced in so long that his body barely remembered the mechanics. "I owe you more than I can calculate." "Then stop calculating." Lysandra turned to face him fully. The lamplight in the privy chamber was low and warm, and it caught the exhaustion in her face, the shadows beneath her eyes, the strain of a night that had required her to deploy every tool she had built in 14 months of isolation. But underneath the exhaustion was the same bedrock composure that had carried her through exile and restoration and the walk across a ballroom floor that had changed the course of an empire. Calculating is what got you here. Every relationship measured by what it costs and what it returns. Every person evaluated by their strategic utility. You managed your grief that way. You managed Celestine that way. You managed me that way. And the one man you trusted most used your own system against you because the system was never designed to account for the one variable that actually matters, which is whether someone is telling you the truth. The words landed in the chamber like stones dropped into still water. Caedric absorbed the impact, not with the deflection he would have employed a day ago, not with the controlled redirect, not with the strategic reframing that transformed emotional confrontations into manageable transactions. He absorbed it fully, the way a man absorbs a wound when he finally stops running from the blade. "I do not know how to do what you are asking," he said. And the admission cost him more than any political concession he had ever made, because political concessions are performed, and this was not a performance. This was a man standing in the ruins of his own operating system, telling the only person he trusted that the system had failed, and he did not have a replacement. "I am not asking you to know how," Lysandra said. "I am asking you to start." Above them, the ballroom still churned. The arrests would continue through the night. The Imperial investigators would work until dawn, dismantling the network Harlan had built across 11 years of patient corruption. Ministers would fall. Alliances would fracture. The political landscape of the Empire would be unrecognizable by morning. And somewhere in the controlled chaos, Lady Celestine Vane sat in a guarded antechamber, stripped of the sapphire necklace, stripped of the influence that had been her only currency, waiting for a judgment that would determine whether her desperation had purchased destruction or merely accelerated an inevitability that was always going to arrive. But the immediate crisis, the accusation Harlan had leveled, the threat to the duchy's sovereignty, that required action before anything else. And the action required something Caedric had never done in his professional or personal life. He had to relinquish control, not to an advisor, not to a strategist, not to someone whose loyalty was transactional, and whose counsel was designed to serve their own interests, to a partner. "The 48-hour deadline," Caedric said. "The auditor will need the full record set, cross-referenced, annotated, correlated with the dates in Celestine's documents. I know what is required, but I cannot produce it from the capital. The original ledgers are at Storm Hollow. Copies are meaningless to an Imperial audit. They will want originals with my hand and the estate seals. Then we go north." "We?" The word stopped him, not because it was unexpected, but because of what it implied. We. A word he had not used in genuine partnership since his first wife died. A word that required the acknowledgement that two people could operate as a single unit, that control could be shared rather than hoarded, that the man at the apex of the Ravaryn power structure could ride 400 miles north to a fortress he had used as a dumping ground and work beside the woman he had sent there. "We," he confirmed. His voice was rough, certain, the certainty of a man who has been stripped of every false foundation and is standing for the first time on something real. "I've spent 4 years making decisions about territories I never visited, about estates I never inspected, about a wife I never knew. That ends tonight." Lysandra studied him, searching for the calculation, the strategic motive, the transactional engine that had driven every decision he had made since grief turned him into a machine. She did not find it. What she found instead was something she had not seen in Caedric Ravaryn's eyes since the day they met. Something raw and terrified and stubbornly present, despite every instinct telling it to retreat behind the armor that had protected him for 4 years. Willingness. Not competence, not control, not the polished confidence of a duke who manages crises the way other men manage schedules. The willingness to be uncertain, to be wrong, to need someone and admit the need out loud. It was, she understood, the most dangerous thing he had ever done. "The roads north will be brutal this time of year," she said. "I have survived worse." "No, you have endured worse. There is a difference." She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she turned toward the chamber door. "We leave at dawn. I will need access to the household treasury for travel provisions. And Caedric." He looked at her. "When we reach Storm Hollow, you will see what I built. All of it. The fields, the infrastructure, the people. You will see what was possible in the place you threw away." Her voice was steady. Not cruel, not punishing. Just the unvarnished truth delivered with the same composure that had dismantled Celestine's power play and Harlan's accusation in the span of a single night. "And then you will decide what kind of man you want to be. Not for the Empire. Not for the Duchy. for the life that exists after the walls come down. She left the chamber. Caedric stood alone beneath the ancient stone ceiling and listened to her footsteps fade down the corridor. His heart was hammering, not from fear, not from strategy, from the terrible, exhilarating recognition that for the first time in 4 years, he was not in control of what was happening to him. And for the first time in 4 years, he did not want to be. The horses were saddled before first light, a small escort, a fast carriage, provisions for a 4-day hard ride north through winter roads that would test the axles and the endurance of everyone aboard. Behind them, the capital burned with the slow fire of political upheaval. Arrests continued. The imperial auditor assembled a team. Harlan Drace sat in a guarded cell and calculated diminishing odds. Ahead of them, 400 miles of frozen road stretched toward a fortress that one of them had abandoned and the other had resurrected. Caedric climbed into the carriage. Lysandra was already inside, and as the wheels began to turn and the palace spires vanished behind them into the gray winter dawn, neither of them spoke. But the silence between them had changed. It was no longer a wall. It was a bridge. Fragile, untested, built from nothing except the mutual recognition that what waited at the other end of this journey was either the salvation of everything they both stood to lose or the final confirmation that some things, once broken, stay broken no matter how hard you try to rebuild them. The carriage moved north. The Empire held its breath, and 48 hours began to count down. The carriage reached Storm Hollow Keep on the 3rd day, 12 hours ahead of schedule, because Lysandra had rerouted them through a pass that did not exist on any official map. She had discovered it during her 8th week at the estate, when a tenant farmer named Oren mentioned that his grandfather used to drive cattle through a gap in the eastern ridge that cut a full day off the northern road. Lysandra had surveyed the route herself, on foot, in November. She had marked the path, calculated the gradient, and filed the information away the way she filed everything. Quietly. Precisely. Against the possibility that it might matter someday. It mattered now. Caedric said nothing when she redirected the driver. He watched her navigate from memory, calling out landmarks in the gray winter landscape with the casual certainty of someone who had walked this ground until it became part of her internal architecture. And he understood something that settled into his chest with the weight of an indictment. She knew this land better than he did. She knew his land better than he did. The keep appeared through the snow like a dark hand rising from white earth. Caedric had not seen Storm Hollow in over a decade. The last time he had visited, it had been a crumbling monument to neglect, a fortress whose only function was to remind the Ravaryn family that some assets were not worth maintaining. He remembered broken walls, overgrown courtyards, the smell of damp stone and abandonment. What he saw now stopped him in the carriage doorway. The outer wall had been rebuilt, not restored to decorative perfection, but repaired with the functional pragmatism of someone who understood that a wall's purpose is to stand, not to impress. The courtyard was cleared, the flagstones were patched. Smoke rose from 3 separate chimneys, which meant 3 separate sections of the keep were heated and occupied, which meant the building was not just maintained but lived in. Brennan met them at the gate. The old steward looked at Caedric with an expression that held neither deference nor hostility, just the weathered assessment of a man who had watched the Duchess rebuild this place stone by stone and was reserving judgment on the Duke who had let it fall apart. "Your Grace?" Brennan said to Lysandra. Then, after a pause calibrated to communicate exactly the right amount of acknowledgement, "Your Grace," to Caedric. Lysandra moved through the estate with purpose. She led Caedric through the keep without narration, without explanation, without the guided tour that a lesser person might have constructed to maximize the impact of what she had accomplished. She simply walked, and he followed, and the evidence spoke for itself. The great hall had been cleared and resealed. The kitchens were operational. The estate office, where she had spent hundreds of candlelit hours bent over ledgers that refused to balance, was organized with a precision that made Caedric's war chamber look careless. Maps on the walls showed field rotations, drainage systems, tenant boundaries, and trade routes annotated in Lysandra's hand with notes so detailed they constituted a complete operational manual for the Northern Territories. She had not just managed the estate. She had documented it, every decision, every expenditure, every negotiation, A paper trail so thorough that the imperial auditor would not need to interpret it. He would simply need to read it. The ledgers are here. Lysandra opened a heavy oak cabinet in the estate office. Inside, arranged by date and category, were 14 months of financial records. Originals, sealed with the Stormhollow estate mark and countersigned by Brennan as witness. Revenue accounts, expenditure logs, trade agreements, tenant contracts, every grain shipment, every supply purchase, every labor payment, cross-referenced against the expected central allocations that never arrived. Caedric pulled the first ledger from the shelf. He opened it, read the first page, read the second. His fingers moved across the columns with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been reading financial documents since he was old enough to hold a quill. And what he found in those columns was not just evidence. It was a portrait. Every entry told the story of a woman working with almost nothing and refusing to accept that almost nothing was all she had. Revenue scraped from barren fields through planting strategies that squeezed yield from soil that should have been fallow. Supply costs reduced through negotiations that leveraged the Ravaryn name, even though the Ravaryn treasury had abandoned the territory. Maintenance funded through a combination of labor exchanges with tenant farmers who had agreed to work on the keep's infrastructure in return for reduced rents that Lysandra calculated to the last coin to ensure both parties survived the arrangement. She had run an empire in miniature, without support, without recognition, without a single message from the man whose name she carried and whose legacy she was preserving while he was busy ignoring her existence. Caedric closed the ledger. He did not close it gently. He pressed it shut with both hands and held it against the desk and breathed, and the breath came out ragged because the air in this room was thick with the accumulated weight of everything he should have done and did not do and could never undo. "I need to see the fields," he said. Lysandra looked at him, searching again, the way she always searched. Not for deception, but for the particular kind of self-deception that Caedric had perfected over 4 years and that she had learned to identify the way a physician identifies symptoms. She found something different this time, not the calculated interest of a man evaluating a strategic asset, something raw, the look of a man standing in a building he tried to forget, surrounded by evidence of a life he tried to erase, and finally allowing the full weight of that erasure to land. "Put on heavier boots," she said. "The eastern drainage path is still muddy from the thaw." They walked the estate together, Lysandra and Caedric and Brennan trailing 20 paces behind, close enough to be useful and far enough to give them the illusion of privacy. The winter air was sharp and clean and carried the smell of turned earth and wood smoke and the particular stillness of a landscape that has been tended by someone who respects it. Lysandra showed him the drainage channels she had rebuilt, the tenant farms where production had doubled, the road repairs that had reconnected Stormhollow to the northern trade route, the grain stores that were full for the first time in a decade because she had negotiated a cooperative storage agreement with 3 neighboring estates that shared the cost and the benefit. She did not explain what each improvement meant. She did not translate the agricultural details into strategic language or frame the accomplishments in terms he would find impressive. She showed him the work. That was all. The work and the land and the people who had done the work and lived on the land and who looked at the Duchess of Ravaryn with an expression Caedric had never seen directed at anyone in his family. Trust, not the careful, calculated trust of political allies, not the transactional trust of trade partners, the earned trust of people who had been abandoned and then unabandoned, who had watched a woman arrive with 2 trunks and no support and proceed to fight for their survival with the same ferocity they had been told only dukes and generals were capable of. An old tenant farmer named Marin stopped them at the edge of a newly cleared field. She was 70 if she was a day, bent by decades of work that the Ravaryn duchy had benefited from and never acknowledged. She looked at Caedric with eyes that held no awe and no resentment. Just the frank, unimpressed assessment of a woman who had outlived 3 dukes and expected to outlive this one too. "So you finally came," she said. "I did. Took you long enough." Caedric looked at her, at the lined face and the calloused hands and the absolute refusal to perform deference for a man who had earned none. And something happened in his chest that he did not have a name for because he had spent 4 years systematically eliminating the vocabulary of emotions from his operational language. "Yes," he said, "it did." Meryn looked at Lysandra. The look between the two women contained an entire conversation that required no words. Then Meryn nodded once and walked back to her field, and the nod carried more weight than any diplomatic commendation Caedric had ever received. That night, in the estate office, Caedric and Lysandra worked side by side preparing the audit documentation. The candles burned low. The fire in the hearth crackled and settled. Outside, the northern wind pressed against the keep's rebuilt walls and found them solid. They did not speak for the first 2 hours. The work was detailed and demanding, requiring the kind of focused precision that leaves no room for conversation. Lysandra organized the ledgers into chronological sequence, while Caedric cross-referenced the expected central allocations against the actual disbursements recorded in Harlan's compromised system. The gaps were enormous, systematic, the financial equivalent of a slow bleed that would have killed the patient if the patient had not found a way to generate its own blood supply. He targeted the north specifically, Caedric said, breaking the silence without looking up from the documents. The diversion pattern shows deliberate concentration on territories that were already underperforming. He knew I would not investigate declining revenue from estates I had already written off. He knew you well. He knew the version of me I showed him, the version that runs on efficiency and treats every relationship as a system to be managed. Caedric set down the quill. His hand was stiff from hours of annotation. He flexed it, looked at the ink stains on his fingers. I thought that version was strength. I thought controlling everything meant I could not be hurt. And the entire time, the one thing I could not control was the one person I trusted to help me control everything else. Lysandra stopped writing. She set her own quill down with the deliberate care of someone who recognizes that the next few minutes matter more than the last 14 months. Harlan did not betray a weak man, she said. He exploited a wounded one. There is a difference. The result is the same. The result is never the same. A weak man loses his duchy and blames the world. A wounded man loses his duchy and asks himself what he refused to see and why he refused to see it. She paused. The candlelight moved across her face, catching the exhaustion and the resolve, and the particular kind of beauty that comes not from symmetry, but from endurance. You are sitting in this room at midnight, reading ledgers, preparing to submit your own governance failures to an imperial auditor. That is not weakness, Caedric. That is the hardest thing a man with your pride can do. He looked at her. The woman who had laid out her conditions in a drawing room and honored every one of them. Who had accepted exile without protest and transformed it into something that now held the power to save the very man who had imposed it. Who had walked into the most dangerous ballroom in the empire and dismantled a conspiracy with knowledge instead of fury. I owe you an apology, he said, not the strategic kind, not the kind that manages a relationship or restores a public image, the kind that costs something. Then give it. I sent you here to disappear. I chose Celestine's comfort over your existence because Celestine required nothing from me that I was afraid to give. She wanted access and influence and the proximity to power that made her feel significant. I could provide all of that without opening a single door inside myself that I had locked after the funeral. He stopped, breathed. The breath was unsteady, and he did not try to steady it because steadying it would have been the old reflex, the control mechanism, the armor. You required something different. You required honesty. And honesty meant facing the grief and the fear and the knowledge that I am capable of loving someone and losing them. And I was not willing to face that, so I put you somewhere I would never have to. The room was very quiet. The fire popped once. A log shifted. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches of the estate's old elm trees with a sound like breathing. Lysandra's eyes were bright, not with tears. With the particular intensity of a woman hearing, for the first time, the truth she had known all along delivered by the man she had been waiting to hear it from. I built Storm Hollow because it needed building, she said. Not because I was trying to prove something to you, not because I was earning my way back into your life. I built it because the land was suffering and the people were suffering, and I could not stand in the middle of that suffering and do nothing. That is who I am. That was who I was before I married you, and it is who I will be, regardless of what happens between us. I know. Do you? Because knowing it means accepting that I am not a function of your needs. I am not a strategic asset. I am not the solution to your governance crisis, or the answer to Harlan's betrayal, or the redemption arc that makes the story of the ruthless Duke end well. I am a person, with my own damage and my own stubbornness, and my own reasons for staying that have nothing to do with you and everything to do with the fact that I chose this life, and I do not abandon what I choose. Caedric absorbed this. Every word. He let it land without deflection, without the interpretive filter that would normally translate emotional content into strategic data. He sat with it the way you sit with a wound that needs air to heal, exposed, uncomfortable, necessary. Then what do you want? He said. Not a strategic question, a genuine one, asked by a man who had spent so long managing other people's utility that he had forgotten to ask about their desires. Lysandra was quiet for a moment. The candle nearest to her guttered and recovered. Her shadow moved against the stone wall behind her like a second self, larger and darker and more honest. I want a partner who shows up. Not perfectly. Not with all the answers. Not with the kind of grand romantic gesture that storytellers invent, because they do not understand that love is not a single moment. It is a series of mornings. Choosing the same person every day, even when the day is hard and the person is difficult, and the easier choice would be to retreat behind the walls. She looked at him, steady, clear, the pale eyes that had not flinched in a drawing room or a ballroom or a privy chamber or a frozen northern courtyard. I want someone who stays, the way I stayed. The words settled into the room like snow settling onto ground that has been waiting for it. Caedric stood. Slowly, not with the efficient, purposeful movement that characterized everything he did, with the careful, uncertain movement of a man stepping onto ground he has not tested. He crossed the space between them. 3 steps. 4. Each one a decision, each one a small demolition of the architecture that had kept him at a safe distance from everyone for 4 years. He stopped in front of her, close enough to touch. He did not touch. Not yet. Because the touch had to mean something different than every other gesture of physical proximity he had made since his first wife died. It could not be transactional. It could not be strategic. It could not be the controlled deployment of intimacy that he had perfected with Celestine, where every touch was a mechanism, and every mechanism served a purpose, and the purpose was always the maintenance of a system designed to prevent him from feeling anything real. This had to be real. He reached out and took her hand, not her wrist, the way he had grabbed Celestine's in the ballroom. Her hand. The ink-stained, work-roughened, ledger-scarred hand of a woman who had rebuilt his forgotten estate and saved his compromised duchy and stood in the most powerful room in the empire and defended him with evidence she had gathered while he was busy pretending she did not exist. He held it, and the holding was not graceful or practiced or smooth. It was the awkward, uncertain grip of a man relearning a language he had deliberately forgotten. I will stay, he said. I do not know how to do it well. I will do it badly. I will default to control because that is what damaged men do when they are afraid. I will make decisions without consulting you because 15 years of operating alone has made consultation feel like weakness. I will fail at this, Lysandra, repeatedly. I am telling you that now so that when it happens, you know it is the wound talking and not the man. Lysandra looked at his hand around hers, at the knuckles that were still white from gripping the ledger hours ago, at the fingers that had signed treaties and sealed fates, and never once reached for her in the months since their wedding. That is the most honest thing you have ever said to me. It is the most honest thing I have ever said to anyone. She turned her hand inside his grip, not pulling away, adjusting, interlocking. The way 2 pieces of a structure fit together when they were always designed to connect, but no one had bothered to check the alignment until now. Then we start here, she said. The audit documentation was delivered to the Imperial Auditor 3 hours before the deadline. A mounted courier carried it south at speed, bearing 14 months of meticulous records sealed with both the Stormhollow estate mark and the Duke of Ravaryn's personal sigil. For the first time in the history of the duchy, both seals appeared on the same document, side by side, equal in authority. The investigators took 6 weeks. The findings were conclusive. Harlan Drace's network had siphoned the equivalent of 3 years' northern infrastructure budget Through subsidiary accounts that existed only as entries in a parallel ledger system he had maintained since the third year of Caedric's rule. 14 imperial officials were formally charged. 8 noble houses were implicated to varying degrees. Baron Aldenmere and Lord Mercer received the harshest sentences. Lady Hargrove negotiated a reduced penalty in exchange for testimony that exposed 2 additional layers of the conspiracy that even Harlan's documents had not revealed. Caedric was formally cleared. The Duchess's records provided irrefutable evidence that the Duke had been exploited, not complicit. The condition of the Northern Territories before Lysandra's intervention, documented in granular detail across 14 months of ledgers, demonstrated exactly what Lysandra had argued in the Privy Chamber. A knowing conspirator does not starve his own assets. Celestine Vane was exiled from the imperial capital by formal decree. Not imprisoned. The Emperor, in a calculation that balanced justice against the political utility of mercy, determined that Celestine's release of the documents, while motivated by desperation rather than civic duty, had ultimately served the Empire by exposing a corruption network that might otherwise have operated for decades. She was stripped of all social standing, banned from court, forbidden from entering any Ravaryn territory. She departed the capital in a single carriage with 2 trunks, heading south toward a minor coastal town where a distant relative had agreed to receive her. The symmetry was not lost on anyone. A woman exiled with 2 trunks to a forgotten place at the edge of the map, the same sentence Caedric had imposed on Lysandra a year earlier, the same loneliness, the same erasure. The difference was that Lysandra had built something from her exile. Celestine would not. Not because she lacked the intelligence, but because intelligence without purpose is just machinery running in place, and Celestine's purpose had always been external. Access, influence, proximity to power. Remove those, and the machinery had nothing to process. Spring arrived in the north the way it always arrives on the moors, slowly, grudgingly, as if the land itself needs to be convinced that warmth is worth the effort. The snow retreated in patches. The fields emerged. Green pushed through brown with the stubborn persistence of things that survive winter by refusing to acknowledge that winter was supposed to kill them. Caedric stayed at Storm Hollow. Not as a visitor, not as an inspector. He stayed because he had said he would stay, and because the word had to mean something if any of this was going to be more than a story about a powerful man who got caught and adjusted. He worked. The kind of work he had not done since he was a young duke learning the estate from his father. Physical work, administrative work, the unglamorous, tedious, essential work of walking fields with tenant farmers and listening to their concerns not as data points to be processed, but as problems to be solved by someone who was present. He was terrible at it. He was impatient. He defaulted to command when collaboration was required. He made 3 separate decisions in the first 2 weeks without consulting Lysandra and had to be reminded, firmly, that the estate she had rebuilt did not operate on the autocratic model he had imported from the capital. She did not soften the reminders. She delivered them the way she delivered everything, directly, without cruelty, but without cushion. And he absorbed them the way he had learned to absorb her truths, with the uncomfortable awareness that growth is not a single revelation, but a daily practice of choosing discomfort over the familiar refuge of old patterns. The duchy reorganized around them. Caedric appointed a new chief advisor, a woman named Sarah Colwick, who had managed the Ravaryn merchant fleet for 8 years, and whose appointment was notable for 2 reasons. She was the first woman to hold the position in the duchy's history, and she was selected by Lysandra and Caedric jointly through a process that involved actual discussion rather than unilateral decree. The Northern Territories were formally integrated into the duchy's central governance structure. Stormhollow Keep was redesignated from a remote outpost to the duchy's secondary administrative seat. The reforms Lysandra had implemented at the local level were scaled across the northern region, and the financial architecture was rebuilt from scratch with transparent accounting systems that could be audited by any authorized party at any time. Trust through verification, not trust through assumption. The lesson Harlan had taught, written in the language of betrayal, translated into policy. One evening in late spring, Caedric found the sapphire necklace. He had not been looking for it. He had been sorting through personal effects that had been shipped north from the capital townhouse, boxes of documents and clothing, and the accumulated material debris of a life that was being reorganized along with everything else. The necklace was in a velvet case at the bottom of a crate marked with the Imperial Auditor's seal. It had been returned to Ravaryn custody after being held as evidence during the investigation. He sat on the edge of the bed in the chamber he now shared with Lysandra and held the case in his hands. The sapphires caught the evening light from the window, blue bleeding into violet. The same stones he had clasped around his first wife's neck on their wedding night. The same stones Celestine had stolen and worn as a weapon. The same stones that had detonated an empire when the Jewel Master confirmed the hidden seal. Lysandra came in from the estate office. She had mud on her boots and ink on her fingers, and the particular windswept dishevelment of a woman who had spent the day doing field inspections and contract reviews in alternating sequence. She saw the necklace. She stopped. The room held its breath. "I found it in the shipment from the capital," Caedric said. "I see." He looked at the stones, then at her. "Every Duchess of Ravaryn has worn this necklace. It was commissioned by the first Duke for his wife 300 years ago. It has been a symbol of the family's legacy since before the Empire existed. I know the history. The history is incomplete." He turned the case in his hands. "The history says the necklace represents the Ravaryn bloodline, that it belongs to the Duchess as a mark of her position, that it symbolizes the continuity of the family's power." He paused. "I would like to change what it means." Lysandra leaned against the doorframe, watching him, the pale eyes steady. "I locked this away after the funeral because I could not look at it without seeing her. And then Celestine stole it and turned it into a weapon, and you turned it into evidence, and the entire empire watched it change, meaning 3 times in a single night." He stood, slowly, crossed the room to where she stood. "I do not want it to mean legacy. I do not want it to mean possession. I do not want it to mean anything that can be stolen or leveraged or used as a symbol of something it was never supposed to be." He opened the case. The sapphires burned in the spring light. "I want it to mean that I chose you, not as a political arrangement, not as a strategic alliance, not as the competent administrator who saved my duchy when I was too proud and too damaged to save it myself. I chose you because you are the only person who ever told me the truth without wanting something in return. And the truth is the only thing I trust anymore." Lysandra looked at the necklace, at the man holding it, at the rough, uncertain, fundamentally transformed man who bore almost no resemblance to the cold, controlled Duke who had stood behind a desk in a capital study and told her she was being relocated to a ruin. "Put it on me," she said. He did. His fingers fumbled with the clasp. Not the smooth practice gesture of a man accustomed to adorning women with jewelry. The clumsy, careful effort of hands that were more comfortable gripping reins and quills and the edges of desks during moments of controlled fury than they were handling something delicate. The sapphires settled against Lysandra's collarbone. They caught the light differently than they had caught it on Celestine's throat. Not brighter, not more impressive, but steadier. The way light looks when it has found a surface that will hold it instead of one that will fracture it into performance. Lysandra raised her hand to touch the stones. Her fingers rested on them for a moment. Then she looked at Caedric with an expression that was not romantic in the way that stories usually require their endings to be romantic. It was something more complicated and more honest. The expression of a woman who has been through a specific kind of fire and has emerged not purified but proven, intact, unbroken. Choosing to be here because choosing is the only verb that matters. "Do not make me regret this," she said. "I will spend every day making sure you do not." That is not a promise you can keep. No, but it is one I can try to keep, and trying is the only difference between who I was and who I am choosing to be. She looked at him for a long time. The spring wind moved through the open window and carried with it the smell of the fields she had restored and the road she had rebuilt and the land she had fought for when no one else would. Then she kissed him. Not softly, not with the gentle, tentative tenderness of a first kiss between two people discovering each other. This was the kiss of two people who had been through a war together and survived it separately and were now standing in the wreckage choosing to build something from the rubble instead of walking away. It was fierce and tired and honest, and it tasted like ink and cold air, and the particular sweetness of a second chance that neither of them had expected, and both of them had earned through different currencies of suffering. Caedric's hand came up to the side of her face. He held her there, not with possession, with presence. The simple, radical act of being completely in a single moment instead of calculating the next 17. When they separated, the room was golden with the last light of a spring evening, and the sapphires at Lysandra's throat caught the sunset and held it the way Storm Hollow held the northern moors. Solidly, permanently, without apology. Summer came to the Ravaryn duchy like a long exhale. The fields flourished. The northern trade routes carried more grain than they had in a decade. The tenant farmers whose trust Lysandra had earned one conversation at a time expanded their holdings, and the revenue generated by a territory that had been written off as expendable became the financial backbone of the duchy's recovery. The court talked. Courts always talk. But the narrative had shifted. The story of the ruthless duke who exiled his wife had become the story of the duchess who rebuilt an empire from a ruin, and the duke who was wise enough to finally see what he had almost destroyed. Caedric stood on the battlements of Storm Hollow Keep one autumn evening and looked south. The direction he had spent 4 years facing, the direction where power lived, where the capital buzzed with political machinery and ambitious men sharpened their strategies, and the emperor's court processed the ongoing fallout of the corruption that had nearly consumed the realm. He had stood on many battlements. He had surveyed many landscapes. He had assessed many strategic horizons with the cold, calculating eye of a man who believed that control was the ultimate expression of strength. He did not believe that anymore. Strength was not the capacity to control everything. It was the willingness to be present for everything. The unglamorous, exhausting, terrifying work of showing up every morning and choosing the same imperfect partnership over the comfortable isolation that his pride kept whispering was safer. Behind him, in the warmth of the rebuilt keep, Lysandra was reviewing the winter planting schedules with Brennan and Sarah Colwick. Her voice carried faintly through the stone walls. Calm, precise. The voice of a woman running an empire that had chosen her the way she had chosen it, through persistence, through refusal, through the stubborn, unbreakable conviction that staying is the only thing that changes anything. The sapphire necklace rested in a case on the desk beside the ledgers. She did not wear it daily. She wore it when the occasion required it, not as armor, not as declaration, as fact. The same way the keep's walls were fact, the same way the restored fields were fact, the same way the partnership between the Duke and Duchess of Ravaryn was fact. Not performed, not proclaimed, just present. And across the empire, in taverns and trading posts and the drawing rooms of noble houses still recovering from the shock of the winter ball, the story was told and retold until it took on the permanent weight of legend. The mistress stole a necklace and thought she was claiming a throne. Instead, she tore the mask off an empire, destroyed herself, and revealed the only woman who ever earned the right to stand beside the Duke of Ravaryn. Not because she was chosen, because she chose to stay. The empire remembered the night the sapphire changed hands, but what endured was not the scandal, not the betrayal, not the fall of ministers or the exile of a mistress or the dramatic confrontation that shook the foundations of aristocratic society. What endured was simpler, quieter, harder to capture in a single moment because it was not a moment at all. It was a series of mornings, a man learning to show up, a woman who had never stopped, and the slow, stubborn, unglamorous work of building something real from the ruins of something that was never meant to last. That is the story. Not the sapphire, not the scandal, the staying.